Imagine a world where the land you've worked for generations is suddenly taken away, fenced off, declared private property, and you're left with nothing but your labor to sell. This isn't some dystopian future. It's the story of the Enclosure Acts, a seismic shift in England's history that reshaped its economy, society, and politics forever. The Enclosure Acts weren't just laws. They were a revolution in how land was owned, used, and valued. They turned common fields into private estates, peasants into wage laborers, and set the stage for modern capitalism. But how did this happen? Why did it happen? And what were the forces that drove this transformation? Let's step back into the rolling fields of medieval England and uncover the causes, the consequences, and the human cost of this dramatic change. To understand the Enclosure Acts, we need to start in the Middle Ages, when England's countryside looked very different. Most people lived in villages surrounded by open fields. These fields weren't owned by one person, but shared by the community. Farmers worked strips of land scattered across these fields, growing crops like wheat and barley. They also had access to common lands, meadows, woodlands, and pastures where they grazed livestock, gathered firewood, and harvested wild resources. This system, called the open field system, was messy, but it worked. It gave peasants a degree of independence. They could feed their families, build modest lives, and rely on the commons as a safety net. The commons weren't just land, they were a way of life, a social contract that tied people to the earth and to each other. But this system had cracks. Change was brewing as early as the 14th century. England's population was growing, and so was the demand for food and goods. Markets were expanding, and landowners saw an opportunity to profit. Land was no longer just a source of subsistence. It was becoming a commodity. The Black Death in 1348 shook things up even more. It killed nearly half of England's population, creating a labor shortage. Suddenly, peasants had bargaining power. They demanded higher wages and better conditions. Some even left their lords to seek work elsewhere. Landowners or lords were losing control, and they didn't like it. This was the first spark, a shift in power that made the elite rethink how land and labor should be managed. Fast forward to the 15th century, and another force emerges: the wool trade. Wool was England's gold. It was in high demand across Europe, especially in Flanders, where it was woven into fine cloth. Landowners realized that raising sheep was far more profitable than growing crops. Sheep needed less labor and vast pastures, which meant converting arable fields into grazing land. This process, called early enclosure, began slowly. Lords started consolidating their holdings, fencing off land that was once shared. Some peasants were pushed off their strips, forced to find work elsewhere. Others stayed, but with less access to the commons. The wool boom was a key driver. It showed landowners that private control of land could mean big profits. It also revealed a harsh truth: the commons were vulnerable. By the 16th century, the Tudor period enclosure was picking up speed. King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 to 1541 poured fuel on the fire. When he broke with the Catholic Church, he seized monastic lands, which made up about a quarter of England's farmland. These lands were sold off to wealthy gentry and merchants who saw enclosure as a path to wealth. The new owners weren't tied to village traditions. They wanted efficiency and profit. They enclosed fields, built hedges, and turned commons into private pastures. This wasn't just economics, it was politics. The crown needed money to fund wars and lavish courts. Selling land to loyal supporters was a way to secure power, but it came at a cost. Peasants, who relied on monastic charity or common lands, were left stranded. The human toll was stark. In 1516, the scholar Thomas More wrote in his book, Utopia, "They eat up men and devour whole fields, houses, and villages." He was describing enclosure the way it displaced entire communities. More wasn't alone in his criticism. Rebellions flared up like Kett's Rebellion in 1549, where thousands of Norfolk peasants rose against enclosures. They tore down hedges and demanded a return to the old ways. Their leader, Robert Kett, declared, "We pray that all enclosed lands be made common again." But the rebellion was crushed. The elite saw enclosure as progress. The commons, in their eyes, were wasteful, chaotic, and outdated. What drove this push for enclosure wasn't just greed, though that played a part. It was a deeper shift in ideas about property and progress. The Renaissance and later the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking. Philosophers like John Locke argued that land gained value only when it was improved through labor. If you fenced it, Farmed it or grazed it efficiently, it was yours. This idea justified enclosure. It painted common lands as backward and unproductive. It also aligned with the rise of mercantilism, a system where nations competed for wealth through trade and colonies. Enclosing land boosted agricultural output, which fed growing cities and fueled exports. It was a vicious cycle. Profit drove enclosure and enclosure drove profit.
Do you like to dig deeper? Political economy is full of powerful ideas. You're right in the thick of it. Insightful, thought-provoking, expanding every step of the way. From Adam Smith and the rise of capitalism to Marx's bold critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more. Or we explore it all, clearly and from every angle. Keep the momentum going. Check the links, dive deeper, and subscribe for more.
By the 17th century, enclosure was becoming systematic. The English Civil War from 1642 to 1651 showed how deeply land divided the nation. Parliamentarians, many of whom were landowners, pushed for enclosure as a way to modernize. They saw themselves as building a New England one, where property rights trumped tradition. The Diggers, a radical group led by Gerard Winstanley, fought back. In 1649, they occupied common land in Surrey and planted crops, arguing that the earth was a common treasury for all. Their vision was crushed, but their words lingered. The earth, Winstanley said, was made to be a common livelihood to all mankind, without respect of persons. The real explosion of enclosure came in the 18th and 19th centuries with the Enclosure Acts. These were laws passed by Parliament that formalized the process. Between 1700 and 1850, over 5,000 acts were passed, enclosing roughly 7 million acres, about a fifth of England's land. Each act was a deal struck among local landowners. They hired surveyors, drew maps, and divided the land. The commons were carved up, hedges and fences went up, and small farmers were often given tiny plots or nothing at all. The acts weren't neutral. Parliament was dominated by landowners who stood to gain. The process was ironically called enclosing. The commons were enclosed by law but also enclosed by power. What caused this surge in parliamentary enclosures? The agricultural revolution was a major driver. New farming methods like four-field crop rotation and selective breeding demanded bigger fields and more control. Farmers wanted to experiment with turnips, clover, and livestock, but the open field system was too fragmented. The Industrial Revolution added pressure too. By the 1760s, cities like Birmingham and Manchester were booming. They needed food, and workers' enclosure freed up both. It boosted crop yields and pushed peasants into factories or urban slums. The population of England doubled from 1700 to 1800, reaching 9 million by 1801. Enclosure fed this growth, but it also created a new class of landless laborers. The economic logic was brutal, but the social cost was worse. Enclosure shattered rural communities. Families who had lived on the land for centuries were evicted. Their homes were sometimes burned to prevent them from returning. Women and children suffered most as men could seek work in cities or mines. The commons had been their domain, a place to gather herbs, tend animals, or fish. Without it, they were destitute. In 1801, the poet John Clare, a son of peasants, wrote, "The commons are taken. The commons are gone." He called enclosure a curse that turned the poor into slaves of necessity. His words captured the grief of a lost way of life. Was enclosure inevitable? Some historians say yes. The pressures of population markets and technology were too strong. Others argue it was a choice driven by power and ideology. The elite could have modernized agriculture without destroying the commons, but they didn't. Enclosure concentrated wealth and land in fewer hands. By 1800, about 15% of the population owned nearly all of England's land. The yeoman farmer was a fading memory, replaced by tenant farmers and wage laborers. This inequality fueled later struggles like the swing riots of 1830, where laborers smashed threshing machines that stole their jobs. The Enclosure Acts didn't just change England, they set a blueprint for the world. The idea that land should be private and productive spread to colonies like Australia and Canada, where indigenous commons were enclosed with even greater ruthlessness. Enclosure was a turning point in the rise of capitalism. It created a system where land, labor, and wealth were commodities to be traded. It laid the foundation for industrial growth, but it also sowed seeds of inequality that we see today. So what do we take from this story? The Enclosure Acts were driven by a mix of economic ambition, political power, and cultural shifts. They transformed England from a land of commons to a land of capital. They brought progress, but at a staggering human cost. The peasants who lost their fields didn't just lose land, they lost a way of life. Their story reminds us that progress is never neutral. It creates winners and losers, and it's shaped by those who hold power. As we look at our own world with its debates over resources and rights, the Enclosure Acts offer a stark lesson. History is not just a story of change, it's a story of choices.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.